Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. The story we know as A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens was first published under the name A Christmas Carol in Prose, being a ghost story of Christmas. First published in 1843, it takes place in contemporary Britain, a time of coal stoves, horses, and carriages. The story begins on a frigid Christmas Eve in a firm called Scrooge and Marley. Jacob Marley had died 7 years earlier, but his partner, Ebenezer Scrooge, an elderly miser, is still alive and kicking. He never bothered to remove his partner's name from the sign. At the story's onset, he's sitting in his counting house, grumbling about the absurdity of Christmas. His clerk, Bob Cratchit, overworked and underpaid, shivers in an adjacent room. The room is poorly heated because Mr. Scrooge keeps the coal needed to heat the room locked up in order to save money on heating. That Christmas Eve, Scrooge is visited by his nephew Fred. Fred invites Ebenezer to a Christmas party at his home, but Scrooge dismisses his invitation with the words, "Bah, humbug." Next, Ebenezer is visited by two men asking for donations to provide food and heating for the poor. These men are too dismissed with a "bah, humbug." Finally, as the workday comes to an end, Scrooge gives Bob Cratchit the next day off for Christmas, but not before calling Christmas a poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December. So far, we've seen Scrooge as a greedy, Christmas-hating, mean old jerk, in spite of being wealthier than most of the folks around him. Scrooge leaves work and goes home. When he gets there, he's unlocking his door, and the knocker to his apartment door quickly turns into the face of his dead business partner, Marley. This spooks him a little bit, but he's a skeptical man, so he doesn't panic. The knocker returns to normal, he goes inside, he checks around for anything out of the ordinary, convinces himself that everything is fine, when a bell starts to ring. Slowly at first, then more and more. Within a minute or so, all the bells in his house are ringing. Now, Ebenezer hears the sound of a dragging chain. Suddenly, the ghost of his dead partner appears through the cellar door. Scrooge recognizes the ghost as his partner Marley by the way he wears his pigtail. His usual waistcoat, tights, and boots. The tassels on those boots are bristling, as well as the pigtail and his coat skirts and the hair on his head. He also had a chain clasped around his middle. It was long and wound about him, and it was made of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses, wrought in steel. His body was transparent, so that while Scrooge was looking at him, he was also looking through him. He could see the two buttons on the back of his coat. Marley tells Scrooge a sad tale of his afterlife. He says he's cursed to wander the world as punishment for his miserly life of greed and selfishness. He then warns Ebenezer Scrooge in these words, "You have yet a chance and hope of escaping my fate, a chance and hope of my procuring, Ebenezer." In other words, Marley stuck his neck out for Scrooge, and 3 ghosts are going to be visiting him in the night to possibly free him from the curse that Marley suffered. After this strange experience, Scrooge somehow fell asleep and woke up to a church bell. The bell chimed 12. Scrooge had gone to bed after 2 a.m., so he was confused. He checked his own clock and confirmed that the time was correct. He went to the window. Looking out, all seemed calm, like any other midnight. He returned to his bed and laid there perplexed, until the bell tolled 1 o'clock in the morning. At this time, light flashed, and as curtains opened, there stood a figure, described as such. It was a strange figure, like a child, yet not so like a child, as like an old man, viewed through some supernatural medium which gave him the appearance of having receded from view, and being diminished to a child's proportions. Its hair, which hung about its neck and down its back, was white as if with age, and yet the face had not a wrinkle in it, and the tenderest bloom was on the skin. The arms were very long and muscular, the hands the same, as if its hold were of an uncommon strength. Its legs and feet, most delicately formed, were bare. It wore a tunic of the purest white, and around its waist was bound a lustrous belt, the sheen of which was beautiful. It held a branch of fresh green holly in its hand, and, in singular contradiction of that wintry emblem, had its dress trimmed with summer flowers. But the strangest thing about it was that from the crown of its head there sprung a bright, clear jet of light, by which all of this was visible. It also had a great extinguisher for a cap, which it now held under its arm. Remember that light and extinguisher for a little later. "Who and what are you?" Scrooge demanded. "I am the ghost of Christmas past." "Long past?" inquired Scrooge. "No, your past." And that is what the ghost showed Scrooge. Scrooge saw himself as a young boy. He was lonely and he spent his time reading. His schoolmates went home while he spent Christmas alone at his boarding school. He shows pity for himself. Next, he saw a pleasant Christmas memory of his sister, Fan. She's the now dead mother of his nephew, Fred. You could tell there was a fondness for his little sister from a conversation that Scrooge had with the ghost of Christmas past. Next, he saw himself slightly older. He was at a party. He recognized the place. It was where he did an apprenticeship with a merchant named Fezziwig. The party had fiddlers and dancing, meat and cake, and more dancing. Fezziwig and his wife were the life of the party, outdancing everyone else there. Young Scrooge was grateful to his master for the party. Even elderly Scrooge enjoyed reliving the party and praised Fezziwig for throwing the party and making so many people happy. And then Scrooge sees himself as a young man. This Christmas he was with a lady, young Scrooge's lover named Belle. She's dumping him, though. She said that he cannot love another due to his love of money. She says that he's changed and is no longer the man who she wants to marry. Fast forward to another Christmas, you see Belle again, but this time she's much older. She's happy with her many children and her husband. The husband mentions that he saw Scrooge all alone at work while Marley laid on his deathbed. Upon hearing this, Scrooge begs the ghost to let him go home. He becomes increasingly emotional. Finally, Scrooge uses the ghost's own cap to extinguish the light on his head, and he finds himself back in his own bed. And he quickly falls back asleep. He woke up, though. The clock struck 1 again, but this time a ghost did not enter his room. Instead, Scrooge saw light coming in from another room. As he approached, he saw a room filled with green plants and ivy. There was a ghost, and he's introduced like this. Heaped up on the floor to form a kind of throne were turkeys, geese, game, poultry, great joints of meat, sucking pigs, long wreaths of sausages, mince pies, plum puddings, barrels of oysters, red-hot chestnuts, cherry-cheeked apples, juicy oranges, luscious pears, and seething bowls of punch, which made the chamber dim with their delicious steam. Chilling on his seat there was a jolly giant, glorious to see. He held a glowing torch shaped like Plenty's horn, and he held it up high to shed its light onto Scrooge as he came peeping around the door. "Come in," exclaimed the ghost. "Come in and know me better, man." The ghost introduced himself as the ghost of Christmas present. The ghost showed Scrooge Christmas morning in the town. Townfolk were busy shoveling snow, doing their last-minute shopping, going to church. They were cheerful in spite of the bleak weather. Eventually, the shops closed and people hurried home for Christmas dinner. The ghost of Christmas present led Scrooge into the suburbs and to the home of his clerk. They watched a large, bustling Cratchit family prepare a miniature feast in their meager home. Scrooge discovers Bob Cratchit's crippled son, Tiny Tim, a courageous boy whose kindness and humility warms Scrooge's heart. The family toasts to Christmas. Tiny Tim says, "God bless us, every one." Scrooge asks the ghost if Tiny Tim will live. The ghost answers by saying the boy will die if nothing changes. Scrooge asks the ghost if Tiny Tim will live. The ghost answers by saying that the boy will die if nothing changes. These words saddened Scrooge, but he didn't have time to dwell on them because he heard his own name spoken. Bob Cratchit toasts the health and happiness of Mr. Scrooge. Mrs. Cratchit protests, but eventually the whole family drank to Scrooge's health and happiness, but not enthusiastically. The mere mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the party. It was not dispelled for a full 5 minutes. Following dinner with the Cratchits, Scrooge sees how other people celebrate Christmas. They saw miners, lighthouse workers, sailors, all celebrating merrily. They were appreciating the day in spite of everything else. Finally, he finds himself in the presence of his nephew, Fred. Fred is laughing and discussing his interaction with Scrooge on the previous day. He expresses pity for his uncle. The party continued into the night, and Scrooge was enjoying it thoroughly. He begged the ghost to stay longer, though the ghost said it was impossible. It said that its life on the human globe would end at midnight. Scrooge noticed that the ghost had aged greatly since they first met. Before disappearing, the ghost of Christmas Present had one more thing to show Scrooge. He kept 2 children under his robe. They were the children of mankind, namely ignorance and want. As soon as the ghost of Christmas Present disappeared, Scrooge could see a dark hooded figure approaching him. The figure approached slowly and gravely, like the Grim Reaper. Scrooge spoke to the ghost, asked him questions, but the ghost did not speak. Scrooge was afraid of this ghost, and he told the ghost that he was scared. Nevertheless, the ghost remained silent as it directed Scrooge where to go. First, Scrooge was brought to a group of businessmen who were talking. Scrooge listened in. They were discussing a recent death. It was the death of Ebenezer Scrooge. From there, Scrooge witnessed others reacting to his death. There were vagabonds selling some of the dead man's stolen possessions, including his bed curtains and blankets, which were stolen right from his bed, while his body was laying there dead. And even the fancy shirt that Scrooge was supposed to be buried in. The woman took it right off his dead body because there was nobody around to stop her. Nobody seemed to care that old Scrooge had passed away. Next were shown a husband and wife discussing their relief at the death of their creditor. Finally, Scrooge is taken to the Cratchit home where Bob Cratchit is grieving. He wasn't grieving over Scrooge's death, but the death of his son, Tiny Tim. Finally, Scrooge sees his own neglected grave and voices his determination to alter the future by changing himself and learning from the 3 spirits that had visited him this Christmas. Suddenly, Scrooge finds himself in his bed. The bed curtains were hanging where they belonged, where they had always been. He excitedly got dressed, determined to change himself and change the future. He ran to the window, looked out into the sunny street, and asked the boy what day it was. The boy said it was Christmas Day. As Scrooge walks through the town, he encounters, in sequence, the same people he treated with cruelty just the day before. Only this time, the newly reborn Scrooge sheds his grumpy bah humbugs in favor of warm holiday greetings. He went to church, sent a large bird to his clerk's home, promised a donation to the 2 men who had visited him the day before, and accepted his nephew's invitation to dinner. The next day, when Cratchit came to work, Scrooge wished him a Merry Christmas, gave him a pay raise, and promised to help his struggling family. Scrooge kept his word. He was better than his word. He did it all and infinitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. He became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as the good old city knew. Or any other good old city, town, or borough in the good old world. And so the story ends with the words, as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us, everyone. Thank you for listening to my retelling of A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. In the description, you can find a link to the full story on Project Gutenberg. That's free. I also included an Audible link and an Amazon link if you want the audiobook or a hard copy. I hope you enjoyed it, and Merry Christmas, forever and always.